For all of humanity, May 7th, 1945 will go down in history as the day the Third Reich surrendered. But for British soldier Sidney Baker, that date was the beginning of a horrifying adventure that tested his survival skills. On that day, he was shot down by Nazi warriors who refused to lay down their arms. Although he survived that brutal attack, that miracle would not have been possible without the brave help of an American soldier who became a true brother in the scorched trenches of Europe. Together, they had to resist not only the indomitable climate, but also rivals willing to do anything to eliminate them. In this new installment of military history, we are going to go beyond enemy lines to learn a surprising story. Let's begin. Aboard an airplane, a group of exhausted soldiers returned home after long months of combat on the European continent. They were British troops who fought the Third Reich until their defeat in May 1945, when the Nazi authorities signed an unconditional surrender after seeing that they were outnumbered on all targets. The aircraft that transported the uniformed men traveled at night, covering itself with darkness to go unnoticed, although there were no longer any enemies to escape from. Or at least that was what the young people on board believed. Suddenly, a flight of a few minutes took a turn towards chaos and death. Of rebellious German pilots who refused to accept the catastrophic defeat of Adolf Hitler and his reign of terror decided to open fire on the British transport ship. The attack was as surprising as it was accurate. The machine gun projectiles penetrated the wings and engines, causing an impressive explosion that lit up the night sky. Those lights were not fireworks. They were the lives of several young people going out simultaneously. The result was fatal. Practically everyone on board the transport died, except for a lucky boy named Sidney Baker. The descent was violent and painful. Only a parachute stood between the young man and certain death. When Baker regained consciousness, he understood what had happened, but he did not know where he was. He was hanging from a tree, and from the height he could see the lifeless bodies of his companions. Fate had not been so kind to them. In the air, he could still hear the threatening buzz of the German aircraft that patrolled the area like hunters of the skies. That sound made him react. He had to go down, and to do so, he had to cut the parachute cords. The fall was abrupt, but there was no time to regret it. Baker had to take his rifle and stand up. A few meters away, he could hear the soldiers of the Reich approaching on foot towards his position. World War II may be over, but those wild dogs of Nazism were not going to rest until they caught him and made him their last victim, before surrendering to the Allied forces. Fortunately, the British soldier was able to escape undetected, but his fate had one more twist in store for him.
Komm mit deinen Händen hoch. Lass die Waffe fallen.
I'm sorry, I don't understand.
Come with your hands up. Drop the gun.
I'm dropping the gun.
Down on your knees. Down.
Okay. I'm just reaching in for paper. Letter.
Come on.
Can you give it to my family, please?
Sidney Baker was convinced that his end had come, that this European forest would be his grave, and that the German executioner was just waiting for the right moment to pull the trigger. He even wanted to give him a letter he had scribbled, in which he said goodbye to all his loved ones, whom he had left behind long ago when he left for the front line. In this type of situation, everything seems lost. There is no way to face a rifle that points directly at your heart. That is when luck comes into play, and in this case, he had light eyes and an American accent.
shit, get up! Get down! Get down!
Sidney Baker and the American ran until they were hidden behind some fallen logs that provided them with cover and an ideal place to wait for a small group of Germans. The German squadron had been alerted to the downing of a plane full of British soldiers and had orders to complete the job by eliminating any possible survivors. However, the American and Baker were smarter. They managed to annihilate their pursuers immediately. Once they were in relative calm, it was time for questions. The American soldier was named William Summers, and his squadron was wiped out by the Nazis in the weeks before the surrender of the Third Reich. As for the English team, they all died in the violent landing. Summers was responsible for checking it out, seeing with his own eyes how many of Baker's companions died due to serious injuries and lack of medical attention. According to the American, the best course of action was to escape and kill every German in their path, but that strategy was much easier said than done. After all, they were just two men with limited weapons and ammunition in an unknown area. Who knew how many miles they were from the next Allied-controlled city? Despite the differences between the two men, they agreed that the only way to survive in that hostile region was to work together and stay together in case they had to finish off German enemies. Fortunately, the natural setting provided shelter and allowed them to remain unnoticed for much of their journey. Baker and Summers decided that the best thing to do was to march west, where they could find a free village in which to take refuge and then contact their fellow allies and be taken home. The problem was that the forest was not only full of vegetation and trees, but also of German soldiers who had deserted and were not going to obey the policies of unconditional surrender. The flames of hatred ignited by Adolf Hitler still burned in their hearts, and they did not intend to extinguish them in the immediate future. In one of their closest encounters with death, Baker and Summers hid under a tree trunk, waiting for a Reich soldier to move on. Letting him go was a better choice than killing him, risking him screaming or opening fire. Any noise could alert the rest of the Germans, and the last thing the two allies needed was to be surrounded by the enemy. The tricky thing was that after several minutes, the soldier was still there. It was time to take action to make sure he couldn't make any sound.
Saying you're gonna bring them right to us.
Shut up and cover me. Christoph? Wo bist du?
After the ambush, one of the Germans was left unarmed and at the mercy of Baker and Summers. The British soldier was unable to shoot. His enemy's pleas for mercy prevented him from pulling the trigger. For him, a human life was valuable, even if it belonged to a uniformed man serving an evil empire that had brutally conquered much of Europe. Summers had a radically different opinion. His experiences in northern France and the many high-risk operations he carried out with the United States Army had instilled in him a fierce hatred of his rivals. He could see in them nothing more than the sum of all evils, and as such, they had to be eliminated. After an argument, the American took it upon himself to kill the Nazi. When night fell, the two Allied soldiers prepared to rest. Without flashlights, it would be impossible for them to continue, but they also needed to regain their strength, as they had long days of walking ahead of them in unfriendly terrain. That evening was quiet. Only the sounds of nature broke the silence. When they felt sure that there were no enemies nearby, Both men talked about their lives before World War II. In these talks, they got to know each other in depth, shared photos of their families, and promised to survive to be reunited with their loved ones. The next day, they marched calmly until they came across a second group of Nazis who were patrolling the forest in search of any survivors of the original demolition. This time they could not hide or escape. They were outnumbered, so, to return home in one piece, they had to think of a guerrilla strategy immediately. It was then that Summers had a highly dangerous idea, but if it worked, it would be the difference between life and death. The plan was simple. The American would steal the clothes from the corpse of a deceased German to present himself as another Nazi.
Oh, Klaus hat ihn Freundin. Klaus? Klaus!
Scheiße!
Dressed as an SS man, Summers approached the Germans with Baker in custody. Once the Germans believed that they were dealing with a comrade bringing a new hostage, the two allies took advantage of the Germans' downed guard to eliminate the enemy. This challenge overcome, the allies continued to flee. Heading west, the men were sure that sooner or later they would come across the French border. After that, it would be a matter of time before they found help. However, without clear directions and hiding from the incessant enemy flights, Baker and Summers advanced very slowly. After 2 days, they came across a new convoy of Germans who were stationed in a huge and beautiful old house that had been occupied by the forces of the Reich. The two Allied men entered in search of some kind of radio, or even provisions that would allow them to extend their period of survival. But instead of a plate of food, they found a welcome in the tune of German rifles. Baker and Summers ran terrified through the forest. Not only were they outnumbered, but the enemy had the advantage of surprise. There was no possible tactic other than to flee to avoid being shot in the head. After a few minutes, the British and the American arrived at a clearing. They could no longer hear the distant footsteps of their pursuers. Now everything was calm and a deep silence that can only be found in regions far from large cities. Despite the tranquility that covered the surface, they quickly realized that they were being watched. A few meters from their position were 3 German soldiers who were aiming their rifles, waiting for the right moment to finish off their targets. In situations like this, there is no set strategy or infallible plan. All that remains is to surrender to chance and take a leap of faith, hoping that it is the right one. Coordination and trust paid off. Both soldiers were able to repel the attack, although not without great difficulty. Ammunition began to run out and enemy bullets were landing ever closer. It was just a matter of time before a German cartridge hit the target, and it did. After the shootout, they realized that they were both wounded, although Summers had gotten the worst of it with hits to his leg and torso. Despite the loss of blood, the American, a tough nut to crack, insisted on continuing to walk until he found a safe place. However, the human body has its limits, and after hours of walking, Summers gave up.
I got a family. Can you get this to Sarah? Can you tell her I tried? I tried real hard. And my boy. Get this to my boy. His name's Jake. You tell him I tried.
The terrifying adventure we are telling you about is not a historical event, but rather some of the most shocking moments of the film, Beyond the Limit, by American director Jason Mills. We chose to tell you the ending later, since we will first analyze the events that are inspired by true stories of British soldiers who fought on European soil and came face to face with German troops. The experiences of those brave men served as inspiration not only for Mill's work, but for many other fictions that pay tribute to the sacrifice of Allied soldiers in World War II. When analyzing the deaths that occurred during that conflict, the numbers are overwhelming. It is estimated that 40 million people lost their lives, adding those fallen on all sides and fronts. The nation that had the most victims at the military level was the Soviet Union, partly because it directly clashed with some of the most ferocious German units. According to official data, Moscow suffered the deaths of around 8.7 million soldiers. Of that total, 1 million fell in the Battle of Stalingrad alone, one of the conflicts that changed the course of the war and halted the German advance. The Nazis were not far behind, as they said goodbye to 600,000 of their combatants there. As for the United States, of the 405,000 soldiers who died in World War II, the vast majority did so between 1944 and 1945, the years of greatest activity of Uncle Sam's troops. On the other hand, Great Britain reported 487,950 fallen, occupying the top positions in terms of human sacrifice, precisely the native countries of Summers and Baker, the protagonists of this video. In Jason Mills's film, one of the most interesting aspects is the relationship of brotherhood and constant clash that exists between the English and American soldiers. The truth is that during the conflict, both countries had very close contact, to the point that England was the starting point for the first Yankee troops to fight in Europe. On January 26, 1942, 4,000 soldiers from the 34th Infantry Division of the United States Army set foot on British soil, arriving in Belfast after overcoming the German submarines that dominated the Atlantic, to go down in history as the first American contingent destined to openly join the Second World War in the European theater of operations.
Ship after ship from the New World brings to Britain fresh thousands of American soldiers to the springboard for invasion. These little islands that stood alone 3 years ago when the darkness descended upon Europe, these little islands now become the barracks, the headquarters and the advanced supply dump for the re-entry of the continent of Europe.
Despite the fervent welcome, they were not the first to arrive in the United Kingdom. The difference is that they arrived on its shores officially as combat troops ready to fight against Adolf Hitler. Until that date, they had only joined forces for logistical support and advisory tasks within the so-called Special Observation Group, even before the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, which led the United States to fully enter the Second World War. Those soldiers were received with the enthusiasm of seeing in them an extraordinary reinforcement to win the war, but also with the suspicion of those who saw in the new arrivals an aid that could detract from their heroic fight against Nazism. Those mixed feelings, the natural friction between two apparently close but very different cultures, and the existential situation of those young 20-somethings looking into an abyss that made them live each day as if it were their last, meant that the coexistence between the new troops and the local population was not always easy. During the 2 long years between the arrival of the first units and D-Day, or the massive landing on the beaches of Normandy, the number of American soldiers did not stop growing. This continued until they reached a contingent of 1.5 million troops spread across more than 1,000 barracks, most of them established in the south of England, and often located in environments similar to those of the French geography in which they would have to operate during the fight. In this way, they prepared for one of the most ambitious and important strategies in modern history. This is the preamble to the events that take place in the film Beyond the Limit. In fact, Summers' character probably participated in the massive landing in the north of France, where tens of thousands shed their blood to free the planet from the Nazi yoke. The titanic effort to group the invading force as close as possible to its objectives and in the best conditions transformed the United Kingdom into a gigantic military installation to which new troops were constantly arriving. As Winston Churchill would say, if the British Isles do not sink under their weight, it is thanks to the tethered balloons. These were inflatable devices attached to the ground by steel cables that have come down to us in the iconic images of D-Day, as elements of protection for ground troops against incursions by enemy aircraft. Both in history and in fiction, the union between the military power of the United States and Britain was crucial to defeating the Third Reich. Although it is often said that the Second World War ended in May 1945 with the surrender of the Nazis, so much so that Victory in Europe Day is celebrated in that month, the continent continued to be mired in violence for several months. It was in that dark closing period when incredible epics like those of Baker and Summers in Beyond the Limit happened. Now, referring to the end of the film, at that moment we see the British, already as an old man, returning to the grave of the brother in arms who helped him survive hell. It is a reminder that war is not won only by tanks, bombs, and planes, but by men. In this way, we come to the end of a video full of death and violence. If you like this type of content and want to know more impressive stories related to World War II, we invite you to subscribe and activate notifications on our channel. Without further ado, we say goodbye until the next installment of Military History. Thank you for joining us.